Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for part 2 of True Crime and Trauma, true crime interviewing for podcasters that is trauma informed. And I'm really grateful here to welcome back the wonderful Jaime Albright, a producer at Tenderfoot TV and a trained forensic interviewer. Jaime earned her Bachelor of Sociology degree from Kennesaw State University in 2013 and discovered a love for research and fact-finding while earning her Master's of Social Work from Valdosta State University in 2018. So Jaime, I'm going to go ahead, mute myself and bounce it to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. And thank you to the Podcast Academy for having me speak on this topic. It's really close to my heart and I'm excited to present part 2 tonight. This is True Crime Interviewing for Podcasters, Trauma-Informed Best Practices in Interviewing. And this is post-production, part 2 of the series. So first, we'll start with the agenda. We'll do a brief welcome. We'll discuss CrimeCon and trauma, the intersection of true crime and trauma, some key takeaways from CrimeCon, pre-production, just a brief review about what we covered last time. We'll define the terms and the stages of producing a podcast. We will discuss the trauma-informed post-production do's, the trauma-informed post-production don'ts. And then I'd love just to have an opportunity for us to let's talk about some scenarios. Have you guys type some things in the box? What about this? And if we don't have any scenarios come up, then I'd be happy to share some that we can discuss through the chat. We'll also go over resources. The last time that we presented this presentation, there was a lot of feedback about the need to have a resource list that we can utilize and share with people that we interview. And then at the end, we will open the floor for questions. Amanda did a great job introducing me, so I don't need to go over all of this. I will say that I am very excited to say that my most recent podcast, we won a Webby for Best Limited Series. And that's really important because in my mind, it just shows that we can take a trauma-informed approach to telling stories and still create really good content. And so as a forensic interviewer, I've conducted over 400 forensic interviews and I've testified in court. And a lot of people have asked, how does the work relate? And I think that just shows that there is a correlation. And I think that, and I hope that the people that we interview or the stories that we tell, people can feel that these two things do go together well. So CrimeCon, I am fresh off of CrimeCon. Like I got home Monday night, very late, and was at CrimeCon since very early on Friday. If you don't know, CrimeCon is an annual event dedicated to all things true crime. This year, CrimeCon 2022 was hosted in Vegas and it was sold out. There was about 2,500 people in attendance. And those people were fans, creators, professionals, and experts. Having all these people in the room really gives you a look at where we are in the industry. And I was very thrilled to see that trauma was a topic on several of the panels. So I included some photos there of one of our booths, and Podcast Row was where all the different podcasters had the opportunity to present their show. And I think that it's just really good to see year to year that trauma is being put on the forefront as something that's important for us to be aware of in this field. So on the left side, these are some examples of how we saw true crime intersect with trauma at CrimeCon. On the left side is John Ramsey. John Ramsey, as most of you know, is the father of JonBenet Ramsey. She was killed in around Christmas time in 1996 at just the age of 6 years old. 25 years later, John Ramsey had to take a moment on the stage because he got very emotional in discussing his daughter's case. I think that reminds us that it doesn't matter how much time passes, that talking about grief and bringing up trauma is a very difficult thing for people. And so that's why it's important for us to have these tools. On the left is Kim Goldman. She is a victims' rights advocate, and she is the sister of Ron Goldman. Ron was murdered alongside Nicole Brown Simpson in 1994. That trial was huge. It was the O.J. Simpson trial. And what she has done is taken her experience, her grief, and her trauma, and she has shifted that into a position in which she speaks up for victim rights. She talks about the media and the impact on victims and what it's like for a very private matter to be in the public eye. She did a really great job of reminding us that there are people behind these stories that we tell. Kind of continuing seeing how true crime intersects with trauma. On the left side, David Robinson. This is a fairly new case. David Robinson is the father of Daniel Robinson. Daniel went missing in June of last year, not too far from the time that Gabby Petito went missing. His story had a lot less media attention, and his father has really done a wonderful job in speaking up for Daniel, trying to get his story in front of the media. And this is an example of, again, why this is so important to me, because there are real people behind these stories and they don't need our permission. We don't need their permission to tell their story. And there are real people behind these stories. So it's important for us to tell them with sensitivity. On the left side is Daniel and myself, as well as some of his supporters, and Natalie and Derica from Black and Missing Foundation. If you've not heard of Black and Missing Foundation, they do a really great job of supporting people of color when their loved one goes missing. What they do is distribute flyers. They also provide the family with resources to assist with the grief and the trauma that they go through. Their organization has helped find almost 400 people that have been missing. And when those situations have bad outcomes or difficult outcomes, they connect the families to resources and assist with them, getting their loved one home if that's the case. They're just a really great organization. So to me, I hope this slide just reminds you that there's people behind these stories and that we need to work together with organizations to support them. So the key takeaways for me from CrimeCon are that time does not eliminate trauma. And if you look at this quote from Kim Goldman, she says, grief is inconsistent, volatile, and unpredictable. I think that is such a powerful quote. So when you reach out to interview somebody, it's important to remember that you're calling them out the blue. You don't know what kind of day they've had. It could be a day where they're really feeling that grief and their response to you could be harsh. And that's because they are still trying to get through their difficult situation, even if it's a year or a week ago. And so it's also unpredictable. We'll talk a little bit about that later and how you can help someone have the space to make a decision of whether or not to speak with you. The podcast medium is acknowledging the need for creators to be trauma informed. That is my huge takeaway from CrimeCon. I've gone to CrimeCon several years in a row, and what this showed me is that we are all looking at trauma as something we need to be aware of. And Kim Goldman spoke on the complexity of grief and trauma in the public eye. That's her new book. And what she was doing was encouraging the media to have sensitivity when you're interviewing people and telling their stories. And the other takeaway from CrimeCon is families are speaking up about the importance of their stories being told with sensitivity, with accuracy, and ethically. And so people want their stories to be told. And even those who don't want their stories to be told, they definitely don't want the wrong story to be told. When I spoke to David Robinson, Daniel's father, he said to me that he ended up in the media spotlight because, and this is a quote, I had to speak up to share my son's story, the real story. And so he was hearing so many things that were being shared that were not true, that he had to be the voice for his son. And I felt like that was a really powerful quote. So what this says to me as a podcaster is that trauma-informed trainings like this are valuable resources for podcast creators. So we will do a brief review of what we talked about last time. We talked about the guiding principles that come from the National Center for Trauma-Informed Care. And while these principles are usually applied in medical settings, counseling, settings or schools, it's really important to know that all of these guiding principles can also be applied in the media and in the field of podcasting. We talked about why this was important, because it's ethical to do these things. It can increase the integrity of the industry. We can avoid ethical dilemmas. We can reduce liability. And we talked even about monetization. Companies are supporting podcasts, advertisers are supporting podcasts. And it's important for us to ensure that we're telling these stories truthfully so that there isn't backlash, not just in protecting the individual whose story we're telling, but also protecting ourselves and our organization. And then there is a Podcast Academy Code of Conduct that I encourage everyone to review. We talked about research and how thorough research is important, and that you should have as much research done as you can before you contact the prospective interviewee. We talked about how to contact them with empathy, awareness, respect their decision if they tell you no, give them time if they need to think about it, and answer any questions about your project. Then we talked in depth about the interview itself. I won't go over each step here, but you can decide what the interview process looks like for you. I would incorporate the beginning, middle, and end phases of the interview, kind of that rapport building, reminders about what to expect, kind of the middle of the interview with those open-ended questions, allowing for silence, and then closing out that interview in a way that is respectful and returns the person that you're interviewing back to as much of a neutral state as you can, because that way you haven't push that button and triggered their trauma. And then you say, thanks, have a good night. Help people kind of come back down to a safe, neutral place. And then just a moment to define the terms. As I said last time, I had a really hard time finding a definition for what trauma-informed interviewing and podcasting meant. So I came up with one that I thought fit. And what that is the interviewer takes the appropriate steps to implement strategies to reduce the likelihood of re-traumatizing the victim or survivor. And what this means is we're reducing the likelihood, right? We cannot 100% say that having this person share their story is not going to add to their trauma or add to them having additional grief, but we can put in steps, put in place policies to reduce that likelihood. In the pre-production phase, we plan, we research, we outline, we gather any of our news or media clips, we secure the interviews, and we book and we prep the guest. In our last training, I talked about the production part as well, which is when we record the interviews, script, pull together the content to create your podcast. And that's where we talked about the interview process itself. Today, we'll talk about post-production, which is editing our interviews, audio editing, sound design, transitions, and intros and outros, as well as mixing and mastering. Now, I'm not going to get into the mixing and mastering because that is not what I do at Tenderfoot, but that kind of is a broad definition of post-production. So post-production do's. This is, again, a guide for what are some things that I would consider trauma-informed post-production do's. So re-listen to the interviews that you conducted. A lot of people feel like that's a lot to do. And I'll tell you, we have had times when we have conducted 30 interviews. I re-listen to them all. I may not listen to the chatter at the beginning or the closure, but I'm listening to the meat of that interview so I can hear what it sounds like and remember key parts to that interview. You're going to review your interview notes to recall any statements that the interviewee told you are off limits. And what that means is if that person was actively telling you something and then halfway through they say, you know what, I actually don't want to say that. You're going to have a note on that because we talked about those notes in the first series session that we went through, right? If there's a note there that says, please don't use this, you want to have that highlighted or written down somewhere so that you do not use that in the podcast. An example of that, I interviewed someone for a podcast who was retelling a story where a sibling felt very responsible for what happened to their sister. And so as the person was retelling the story, she said, I've really never forgiven my sister. And she immediately stopped and said, actually, I don't want to say that, because she did not want to cause additional pain to her other sister. So she reworded it, and I had notes where I'd scratched that off. So I knew that was never going to make it into the podcast. You're going to ensure that your edits preserve the integrity of the interview, the meaning of the quotes, and information shared during the interview. And so what that means is you can cut an interview, right? We're never going to play a 2-hour or a 1-hour interview from beginning to end. In podcasting, the beauty of it is it's not live. We can cut things out and we can put together a story in a great, concise way. The challenge with that is ensuring that we're preserving the integrity of the story that the interviewee told. And that's really important. If there's a time in that interview where they say, that's what I used to think, but this is what I think now, you can tell what they used to think, but make sure you include what they think now or how they feel now. Do use your script as a guide when editing interviews. So I know there's different types of podcasts. There's scripted and there's unscripted podcasts, right? We do have scripts for our shows. And so what we do early on is we have a kind of just outline of what we want, right? And as we get all the pieces of the puzzle, we're writing that script to incorporate the voiceover into the podcast. And it's important that that script that you started in the pre-production phase is not in concrete. That script is something that you are going to have to be willing to and open to editing and adjusting if the interviews that you gathered tell a different story than what you thought you were going to get. Again, does this add an extra step to the work that you're doing? It does. I mean, I'll be honest with you, it adds an extra step, because if you've got that script perfect and you know what it's going to sound like, and then something happens and it completely throws off the story, you're going to have to go back to the drawing board on that script. So it is an extra step, but that extra step is worth it to ensure that you are telling the story accurately. Write voiceover that sets up the clip appropriately. So for those of you who do use scripts or write script, that means the host is going to introduce that interview. So when you're doing that, you want to ensure that the voiceover you write sets the clip up correctly and appropriately. You also want to ensure that that voiceover is giving the listener an insight to what they're going to hear, but that you're not explaining that clip. And what I mean by that is let the story be told through the interviews. The VO helps the interviews, not the other way around. You can use partial quotes as long as they do not change the narrative of the interview or the story. And I really, when I wrote that I thought about the fact, for example, in true crime, cold opens are golden. Your cold open is going to draw in your listener. It's going to really start to give them a quick insight to what your podcast is about. And then, of course, what that episode is about. And so we always use partial clips in cold opens. We're getting that listener right there with us with the story we're going to tell. That's fine. Just make sure that you're not picking and choosing certain parts of that interview that support your narrative. It should be telling you what that episode is about and giving you an insight to what you're going to hear later. Do advocate for the interviewee if you are partnering to produce a project. And when I say this, what I mean is some people are individual podcasters where you are doing everything on your own. At Tenderfoot, what we do often is we do shows on our own, but then we partner with other people. So someone can bring a show to us and say, hey, this is a show that I'm wanting to produce. Would you guys like to partner? And so we're working together on a project. If you're in a situation where you're working together on a project, but you have been the person that conducted those interviews, let's say for the person brings you this show, and then you guys are going to divide and conquer. If you've conducted part of those interviews and you guys are coming to the table to put together this project, you need to advocate for the person that you've interviewed. And what I mean by that is, if we go back to early on where I said, preserve the integrity of the interview. If someone is saying, oh, we really, really, really need to use this part right here, and you're realizing it doesn't align with what that person's entire interview was saying, then you're going to say, oh, that actually is not what that quote meant. That's not always comfortable, but it's important to do that, especially if you were the person that reached out to that person to set up the interview. If you've conducted that interview, you're going to have the best insight to what that complete interview story was, not bits and pieces of it. Once an interview has been reviewed, or it's in transcript, or it's tagged, you understand the full interview. So you're the one that's going to advocate for that story to be told properly. The other thing is if someone told you don't use that part, and you're sitting at that table putting it together, maybe the other person doesn't know they said that. That's when you're going to make sure, when you're screening that whole final product that you're putting together, for that episode, if you see one of those quotes in there, it's up to you to say, oh, wait a minute, that's something that we are actually going to have to pull out. Use audio edits to enhance the story and set up the scene without sensationalizing. So audio edits are things like footsteps, someone breathing in a phone. It could be anything that enhances the story. And I know we make true crime podcasts, and we're trying to get people to listen, right? How do we do that without sensationalizing? What that means is do it as close to how it was described to you. Don't add anything, don't remove anything. If someone's describing a scene to you and they say it was a whisper, use a whisper, don't use a scream. That's the best way I could think to describe it. Use disclaimers as needed. And that really goes into the next bullet point here. Sometimes we use voice actors to reenact a scene if we have exact quotes regarding what happened. I'm working on a project right now where we have exact quotes, and we are able to say, this is what was said on this day by this person. I have worked on other projects where we have bits and pieces because it's a really old story. And so we don't want to fill in the blanks. What we want to do is take what we can that we know was said, and then if we need to, use a disclaimer. This voice reenactment that you are about to hear consists of 3 different police reports, and we put this together to the best of our knowledge. Just a short disclaimer, because you don't want to misrepresent something that you found in your investigation or in an interview. So use a voice actor, recreate those scenes, just ensure that you're doing that accurately, and then again, not sensationalizing, and then using those disclaimers as needed. And request a follow-up interview if needed with someone you interviewed. So I'm going to give you an example of this. Sometimes we have some key people in our stories, right? They might be the first person that we interview, and they say, I know the story beginning to end. And so they're sharing all of this information with us about the story that we're gathering interviews for. So we're doing that. And then I might get to the point where I'm like, you know what? I am actually super unclear about this. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to see if they're open to talking to me again. And if you remember in our pre-production conversation, we talked about kind of leaving it open-ended, setting up expectations. So that's when you can ask someone, if I have any additional questions, is it okay if I circle back with you? And I will say with family members, some are going to be open to it. Others are going to just say, I just want to get the story out, and that's that. And that's fine. A lot of times we're circling back with experts on cases, law enforcement that work those cases. So you'll have some people that'll be okay with you circling back with them. Know who those people are and request a follow-up interview if needed to clarify any new information. So post-production don'ts. This is really important, I feel like, this slide here, because when we think about the do's, everyone can go, oh, I can do that. I can do that. The don'ts are a little bit more, they require, I feel like, more of an open mind, right? So don't get stuck in your story. And we talked a little bit about that last time. If in my mind, I know exactly what the story is going to be, if I'm not willing to shift that once I gather new information, then I'm stuck in my story, not telling the story accurately, not telling the story with the interviews that we've recorded. Don't leave out interviews that don't fit the narrative, kind of back into that, don't get stuck in your story. Don't be afraid of the process. I might be a weirdo, but I actually love when I get new information. Most of you know that I work for Tenderfoot with my brother. I was calling him at like 10 p.m. last night because I found something in a document that completely refuted something that we thought. And I kind of, looked at it and thought, oh man, we're going to have to go back to the drawing board about this. But to me, finding that information is important because it's going to ensure that when I tell the story, we're telling it correctly. So I actually enjoy the process. It's more kind of groundwork or footwork. But if you're not afraid of the process, then you're just open to it, right? I'm going where this story takes me. I'm going where these interviews take me. Don't put words in the mouth of the interviewee through VO scripting. So again, back to that voiceover, right? If you are going to summarize what someone says, because their interview is 2 hours long and you've got to do a summary and then share a part of their interview, ensure that that summary in VO is accurate. You don't want to put words into their mouths. You don't want to make assumptions and write that into your VO. Do not rush or edit quickly. When you rush, something's going to be left out or forgotten. When you edit quickly, you might forget there was something that you shouldn't have had in that episode. So take your time when you're in this process of post-production. Don't let a deadline force you to tell an inaccurate story. And I understand that when I say that, it sounds like everyone has tons of time. And I'm not saying everyone has tons of time. Sometimes it's late night changes for us when something is different than what we thought. We have also pushed back deadlines when something has come up that is different. Don't be afraid to do that. If you're working for a larger company, that's going to be a bigger conversation. I understand that. But don't let a deadline force you to just put it out there regardless. Now, if you put something out there and it ends up later on, you determine that it's inaccurate, don't be afraid to go back and correct. What we put out that time was what we knew. What we've now found out is this. Don't make up reenactments with voice actors. So again, it kind of goes back to what we talked about in the do's. Use voice actors. They can be powerful to have somebody read words if you don't have that interview, right? The other thing is, though, don't fill in the blanks with what you think someone said. And that's something that, although it seems like a silly thing, that happens where people get to the point where they are putting together this project and, you might read, oh, the child was walking down the street and she ran into her mom, for example. Don't make up a conversation that happened on that street with mom and the child, because we don't know the relationship with that mother and the child. We can assume, oh, mom said, get home quickly, sweetie, but we don't know if that's really what was said. If you find in writing somewhere where mom tells you what was said, then you can use that because that's based on fact from the mother. Do not give into pressure if you are collaborating on a project. Kind of stand your ground on that comment cannot be used. That was something that they mentioned. I had someone sign a release one time because we do utilize releases at Tenderfoot TV. And at the bottom of the release, he wrote, accept anything I told you not to use. And I thought that was great because he was making sure he was going to hold me accountable to not use something that he had scratched out. And in that interview, I will be honest with you, he said something that I really, really, really wished I could have used. It was powerful, but not only would I not do it, he ensured I would not do it by writing that little message at the bottom of his consent form. Don't be afraid to check back in with an interviewee, what we talked about earlier. Circle back if they seem open to it. Don't share information from questionable sources. And then don't beat yourself up. And what I mean by that is you can put in all the best policies, all the best practices, and your project could come out and the family may not be happy with it. Someone you interviewed may not be happy with it. I'm not saying that we are producing a podcast, that we are letting everyone hear, and we want them to sign off that they loved our work. What I'm saying is that we should implement policies and procedures that ensure that we are trauma informed and that we're honest with the people whose stories that we're telling. If your story comes out, your podcast comes out, and someone is not happy, they will not be able to say that you were dishonest if you adhere to some policies and guidelines. So don't beat yourself up if someone isn't happy with the end result, because you've done your best to adhere to some guidelines and to keep yourself accountable. And don't be afraid to learn and grow. And I say don't be afraid to learn and grow because we do it all the time at Tenderfoot. As I mentioned, have been in podcasting only since 2018. I am always learning and I am always growing. And even with my background in training, there may be a time when something happens that I'm not thrilled with, right? That's going to be a learning moment. It's going to be a moment of growth. And I share that in relation to something that happened at CrimeCon. So many of you probably know that Up and Vanish was Tenderfoot TV's first project. Up and Vanish has over 400 million downloads. Payne Lindsay is the host, and my brother Donald Albright helped executive produce Up and Vanish, and he also is they own Tenderfoot TV. Released in 2016, they have an Oxygen series on TV. It led to the arrest of 2 suspects. Bo Dukes was convicted in 2019 to 25 years. Ryan Duke is currently on trial in Georgia. And we have Up and Vanish, the trial of Ryan Duke, that's kind of going to be released or is released yesterday, the 3rd. I'm like, what date is it? Yes, it was released. And so despite all of that, all of our successes, Payne was on a stage at CrimeCon in Vegas alongside Philip Holloway, an attorney who had worked with him on the case. And they actually talked about the fact that when they put this podcast out, they referred to Tara Grinstead as a beauty queen who vanished. Those are factual things. She was a beauty queen. But what they said on the stage, I thought was really powerful, was that was not well received by everyone in her community. They wanted her to be seen as a human or as a person, right? And so I love that they talked about that on the stage, because again, it shows that willingness to learn and grow, right? We're going to look at each person and each case and each podcast differently, but this show has had a lot of success. And for them to get up there and admit that, Payne said, this was my first project. I grabbed a mic and I went with it, But then there was that opportunity to say, hey, even looking back on it, you never would think that something that small in our minds is not small to the family, right? So next time we put out a show and we talk about someone, we might think back to a title. How do we describe them in a more human way for that family? And again, everyone isn't going to be happy with the project, but we're learning and we're growing. And Freeway Phantom is the project that I am currently really into, that I'm working on. It's going to be releasing in 2022. As I mentioned, we have pushed this back, and we've pushed this back because it is a 50-year-old case. I wanted more information than what I Googled. And when I tell you I got more information, that's an understatement. I currently have thousands of documents, that I'm going through from so many sources that I've organized and categorized and put in different folders. And it is a lot. The new details, some of them that we're getting, actually refute what we thought we knew. And it's looking at that at 11 o'clock at night, finding something and going, take a deep breath, because we've already scripted 1, 2, and 3, and we've recorded 1. We might have to circle back and reword that, because what we know now is more than what we knew when we were putting together those episodes. Or we introduced this as new information in episode 4. But I share this with you because it just shows we're still learning, we're still growing. And when you're working on true crime is nonfiction, right? So we're not making this up. So any information that I have, I want to make sure I know it and I'm presenting it accurately. And so when new details come up, if I've already put the podcast out or the episode out, I want to circle back and I want to clarify the things that have been said. And in this situation, we've been researching this for a long time, but these thousands of documents finally came my way about 3 weeks ago. And so, got to sift through them and make sure that we get it right. So here are some examples of scenarios that you might find yourself in. You're working on a story about a wrongly accused individual. You Googled and you think that the person's innocent. They're 100% innocent. I just know they're innocent. So you're producing this podcast, you secure your interview with a witness that maybe law enforcement hasn't even spoken to. That's something that happened when they were recording Up and Vanish, when To Live and Die in LA. There were different projects where people come up along the way, they hear the podcast and they want to speak. If that person destroys the alibi, what do? Well, obviously, you're going to inform law enforcement of any new information that you have come across during your podcast. But also, you're going to have to be open-minded to the idea that maybe this person, isn't wrongly accused. Now, again, you're not the judge and the jury, but you're not going to exclude that interview if you're able to ensure that it's a good, clean interview that the person's coming forward to give you. That information should be included in your podcast. Another example, you're collaborating on a project with a producer and they insist on using a partial quote that changes the narrative. What do? We talked a little bit about this. We speak up, we share that that's not actually how that quote was stated. That's actually not the full quote. And I think we need to frame this differently. An interviewee signs a consent form. They complete the interview and then they withdraw consent while you're in the production phase. What do? To be honest with you, in this situation, once someone signs a consent, they have consented for their interview to be used in the podcast. That is something that you've got to decide what you want to do moving forward. There's different reasons that people can change their mind, and you have to do what works for you, what works for your company. Once this consent is signed and the interview is recorded and you're moving forward on that process, it can be very difficult to go back and make those changes. And it could also be something that, we don't know why they've withdrawn their consent. So you can ask more questions, you circle back with your company. Everybody's going to have to work that out for themselves. There's not an easy answer. You're working on a 25-year-old story and the media says there was no investigation into the murders, but you find thousands of documents that refute that. That's kind of what I was talking about earlier. You can Google a story and go, I'm going to do a podcast on this. That's actually how Up and Vanish came to be. Payne found the story and he started digging and just followed that story in a wonderful way. It unfolded completely organically. So sometimes you Google a story and what you find is not true. What happens is there might be 5 key facts that everyone runs with, and they do maybe a quick weekly podcast about it, or someone speaks about it really quickly on YouTube. But when you actually have those factual documents in your hands, it might refute what everyone else has said. And then that's when you have to think about how you're going to tell the story and the integrity of the story. And for us, that would definitely be using any hardcore factual documents that we can find to tell a story, instead of just going with whatever we've kind of picked up through a few different sources. And interviewee makes an amazing statement and then says, wait, you can't use that. Well, you just can't use it. That's to me a very clear answer. Because remember, you set up those guidelines when you're conducting the interview and you've told them you can restate things if you'd like to. If there's anything you want to omit, let me know. So you want to hold yourself to that. If they tell you can't use it, you're free to investigate, ask some more questions. What are your concerns about me using this? Talk through that. And sometimes they might say, well, I don't want you to use this because, I mentioned this other person. Was there a way that you can restate it? Maybe and not mention that person. Maybe you might be able to help them find a different way to say it, where that really strong quote will be something that you can use without putting them in an uncomfortable situation either. So Amanda did an amazing job creating a resource list We talked about this last time. It's really important, in my opinion, to share or have a resource list available that you can share with anyone that you interview. And the reason that I think this is important is because you don't know where that person is in their journey, right? If it's the first time they told their story or the 20th time they told their story, you never know if they might be in need of some support. And so just having a list available, you can just say, hey, I have a resource list from the Podcast Academy. Let me send this your way. That list has a lot of different information on it that may help you, because I understand it might have been difficult for you to talk to me today. They may never use that resource list, but you have extended them an opportunity to maybe move forward with some additional support and healing. And as we talked about in part 1 of this series, um, it empowers people sometimes to tell their story. And so they've told their story. They might want to work with one of these organizations to partner and to support someone else who's told their story. So what you're doing with providing them with a resource list so that they then can continue in their healing, or maybe be part of an organization to support others. So at the end, Amanda will go over that resource list. Again, she did a great job. I do want to go to the chat box and answer some questions here. All right. So I have a question where someone said, I'm researching and writing the 2nd season of a true crime podcast. This one is about a very disturbing unsolved murder. I'm wondering if you can offer any insight on telling the story in a sensitive way, in particular the crime scene, which is very gruesome. I guess that is the best word. Anything in particular you would avoid, anything you would add aside from in the beginning, I want to make sure that I'm telling this in the most sensitive way possible. Some background, I am familiar with interviewing those who have trauma, but this is my first time telling a story with such a traumatic crime scene. That is a great question, Steph, and I will tell you that that is something that is a struggle as well for me. If you get a police report and you see how a crime scene is described, if you've never had one, had to review one, I will tell you they can be very gruesome. Sometimes with older cases, I don't know if you're seeing this, Steph, but the victim is even described in a manner that I would never want to share with family members, because things have changed a lot today, but they were different years ago. So what I would say is I would not want to sensationalize the crime scene. I would give details that are pertinent to the story. So there was a button found beneath the bed that may indicate a struggle. There was a light that was broken that may indicate a struggle. These things were found at the crime scene. If you're describing the cause of death, that's something that when we describe the crime cause of death, we might use very medical terms, but I'm not going to describe every single injury on a victim. With Atlanta child murders and with the current project I'm working on, the victims were also children. And so it's really important in those cases, because imagine the family members who've never seen the police reports. In your case, maybe aren't as familiar with the crime scene if it's an unsolved case. They may have never wanted to see it. So when you're redescribing the crime scene, use key facts. And when you mention the word gruesome, yes, you could say it was a gruesome crime scene. And I think a lot of people in their minds can picture that without giving every small detail about what was found on that crime scene or in that crime scene. So those are the things that I would probably set aside. When we have cases in which the victim was sexually assaulted, for example, especially in old cases, there is so much misunderstanding even 20 years ago about the evidence in a sexual assault. I say bring in an expert. That's something that I am a huge advocate for. So an expert would look at the information there, and then they would put it in today's terms. And if they speak on sexual assault or crime often, they're going to say it better than you or I could. So don't be afraid to bring in an expert to help describe that crime scene. We've also done that with some of our shows. And then, oh, it looks like Amanda dropped the doc in the chat box where you can go ahead and look at those resources. I hope that we will also share that on the Podcast Academy site somewhere. Last time we hosted this training, several people talked about, they would love to see there be a policies or guidelines for interviewing, not necessarily a policy, but guidelines, because a forensic interview, even in itself, there's not strict guidelines of how you conduct it. There's a structure, and sometimes you veer away from that structure. So those are things that we're hoping to see as time moves forward as well, that we as an industry, want to work together to ensure that when we tell these stories, we're trauma informed. And I hope that list will be helpful to you guys. And questions, any questions anyone has about what was presented tonight, about any projects that you are working on, I am happy to answer. Let's see. Yeah, go ahead and drop them in the box if you do. If not, I will share maybe some other small tips and tricks for a few minutes. Some tips that I would say are important when you're working in this field and producing a true crime podcast are for you to, and someone brought this up last time, to practice self-care. Because as Steph mentioned, she's putting together a podcast with a really gruesome crime scene. It's a lot to look at. When I look at the documents, thousands of documents pertaining to unsolved cases, that's something else that I am able to, look at and to say, okay, I need a break from looking at this, because at the end of the day, I've consumed a lot of information that is hard to see and is hard to hear. And so I want to make sure that I'm taking care of myself. Another tip and trick is to have someone else on your team with you to advocate. So if you're partnering with another organization or you're working, collaborating, get other people on your team to advocate with you to ensure that that story is told in a manner that is, preserves the integrity of that interview. We are working on a podcast right now with two amazing sisters that I'm really excited about, because what they want to ensure that we're doing is talking about the healing side of this, right? Again, families don't need our permission to share their story, but as we share them, how can we talk about what people's life was like after this and how they've healed as well? Because for some people, that is part of their story, not just the trauma or the tragedy that they experience. So I do love that, we're starting to see more of that in this industry or in this field. Another thing relating to police reports, I mentioned having an expert speak about them. I think that's really important, because we might say it in terms that that an expert wouldn't use, right? And when we do that, we're able to look at the information through our eyes. But if we have an expert speak on it, it's completely different. Karen is in this chat, and she said she appreciates sensitivity and respect for the victims' families. It really shows integrity. You're doing fantastic work. And I just have to brag and say that Karen is an amazing sexual assault nurse examiner that I've had the pleasure of meeting and working with over the years. She is someone that I have shown documents to when I was in those moments, Steph, where I didn't know exactly what something meant. I didn't understand it. And she is someone that, if we do a show and it is describing a sexual assault or something that occurred, if there's information that I need clarified, she's someone that I would reach out to. So have a network of people that you can go to and say, okay, what do you think of this? Is there a different way for me to say this? So I just appreciate everyone being here tonight, and that you guys are excited about the opportunity to, grow this in our community and in the field of podcasting, so that people are trauma aware and informed. And you guys can always reach out to me by email or on Tenderfoot TV's website. And if I can ever provide any insight, I'm happy to do so. So I'll turn it over to Amanda to go over her amazing resource list.
Thank you so much, Jamie, again. And I do know Steph has one more question about police or potential people who are potentially under suspicion for perpetrating a crime or violence, if I'm understanding the question correctly.
Yes. And so if you listen to Tenderfoot TV podcast, you will see, for example, Payne will knock on a door in a heartbeat and interview someone. That is, very brave. I have not interviewed a potential suspect. What I would say though, is if you are going to interview a potential suspect, then be aware that your interview could be used in court if this ends up, leading to an arrest or trial. That's really important to know. I would also say, if you're interviewing potential suspects, to not provide them with information that maybe you have received through your interviews. Use those open-ended questions to say, so I'd love to talk to you about so-and-so who's missing. Tell me what you know. Keep it very broad. You don't have to let them know that you think they're a suspect or people think they're a suspect. Now, they may know that because law enforcement has stated it or things like that. The other thing in reference to suspects, for example, if you're looking at an unsolved old case, make sure you're clear on what suspects you can name and what suspects you cannot. That's something that we have had to be careful with, because we're looking at an unsolved cold case. Some people are no longer alive. And so I want to be cautious and maybe refer to that person and how they were connected. But that person has wife, maybe children, maybe grandchildren. So I want to be aware too of their trauma if I'm going to say their name openly on a podcast that has, for example, hundreds of millions of downloads. And so with interviewing potential suspects, again, I don't have that background in the world of forensic interviewing. We only interview people who are victims or witness to. Sometimes during those interviews, we find out that the person may have offended, but it's not going to be an interrogative type interview. So I would say use open-ended questions, share your information that you get with law enforcement, and be honest with the person about the purpose of your interview.
Really great answers. Again, Jamie, we're so grateful to have you here. I can't stress enough how important and how universally applicable the principles that you laid out are for people who are ever in contact with somebody who may spontaneously or through elicitation disclose possibly one of the most horrible experiences of their lives. So that also speaks to the resiliency and the strength and the generosity of those whose voices these podcasts feature. And so it's also a really wonderful healing experience in a lot of ways for people to have their moment of truth. That's a very important part of the healing experience in a lot of ways. So I want to thank Jamie, you and everybody at Tenderfoot for doing such thoughtful work and investigative journalism. We are hearing more and more about that. It's exciting to hear about the CrimeCon work as well. As Jamie has mentioned, I welcome everybody in here to share this resource sheet. I'm going to go ahead and, if it's okay, Jamie, I'm going to screen share this resource. Let me just go ahead and do that. So please forgive the slight formatting challenges that everybody encounters with Google Documents. I just want to point out, I'm sorry, I'm sharing the wrong thing. Let's try one more time here. Too many Google windows. Un momento, por favor. There it is. Okay. And so I'll just really point out here, what you want to do is go ahead and click File. You're going to make a copy and you can rename it whatever. Just make sure you don't lose it. It defaults into your local Google Drive. And unfortunately, with Google Documents, it does force you to use a Google Documents or a Google account. And after you've made that copy, you can edit it as you see fit. This is based on a resource sheet that I produced back when I was working at a victims support agency based in New York City, hospital based. So those are right here. But if you go ahead and look, and there's US-based resources, and I want to take care to note that this is all subject to local and state laws. And as we all know in the here and now, a lot of, unfortunately, victims' rights, survivors' rights and resources are impacted by local legislation and politics. So you want to be working directly with a local agency to make sure that the facts and the resources here are up to date. If ever possible, it's a good idea to give that resource a phone call to make sure that it's accessible. You might be working with somebody with a communication disorder or a disability. It's also really important to notice, is there a wait time? Maybe they have to access their own language by clicking a few buttons. So that's also something that I think is a best practice, just so that person does have a more trauma-informed, positive experience. That's something maybe somebody on your production team might be able to support you on. You don't have to type the line, just click through and see how that experience is. The last thing I wanted to point out is, underneath these options, again, these are very subject to the culture, community, values, norms of the person who you're sending this to. So I wanted to point out that not all areas have amnesty protections. So sometimes if you're interviewing somebody, to add to Jamie's good points, and they disclose the incident of activity that might not be fully legal, that's something to bear in mind and raise the attention of the person who may or may not be calling one of these resources. So if they have a mandate to report, that's something to bear in mind. This is probably too much information. This is all just to say, it's always just good to be thoughtful about the information you share. And again, that drives back to all of the points in the thought and care that Jamie has demonstrated goes into the work that she's doing as a producer. The last thing is, TPA is a wonderful community of people across the globe. So certainly I don't have the ability to create non-English resources, unfortunately, but hopefully we can outsource that to the wonderful TPA community. Just wanted to point out, this can be a template to follow. It's not hard and fast. These are suggestions of how you could structure a sheet that you create. And it's not only for people who have directly experienced violence, but also the co-survivors, the family members, loved ones, or even somebody who is like Jamie, or a lot of you here feeling secondary trauma or experiencing a lot of overwhelm. So I can't stress enough, again, the last point that Jamie raised, which is taking good care. We don't want to end up in a space where we are inundated or inured to really intense, traumatizing things. That is a byproduct of working in crime victim support or being exposed to really intense narratives. I think that's also a really important point that Jamie raised with crime victims reporters, crime journalists. That's a really common side effect. We are almost at the end of this talk. I wanted to wrap up with a couple requests to you and invitations. First off, before you leave, if you could please kindly fill out our exit survey. We always love to hear how this landed for you, what we can do to follow up, and anything else that you'd like to hear. TPA members, we're grateful to have you here. If you are not a TPA member, you are invited to a free public event. If you are a marketing adjacent professional, if you are a podcaster, please come to this free public event and invite your friends. It's very useful. Again, I'm going to put the hyperlink down there, bit.ly TPA 25 May. If you attend, you are entitled to 50% off an annual membership for the Podcast Academy for your first year. So that's a really exciting opportunity to gain access to our community of 1,000 people or more and growing across the world who are working on many types of podcasts behind and in front of the mic. And lastly, TPA members, please, we do hope to see you at other events. Again, Jamie, this was such a fantastic program. We really are grateful and hope to have you back. There's so many ways we can dive deeper into the many, many points that you raised here. And lastly, again, we welcome anybody who is not a TPA member. Please look into joining the Podcast Academy. It's a wonderful community of supportive, independent, and professional podcasters at large networks behind and in front of the mic. There's so much strength in numbers and a lot of learning and collaboration happening. We're really excited. So with that, I will close this meeting with my gratitude for Jaime. Again, thank you so much, Jaime, for being here, all you're doing, as well as the wonderful trauma-informed people in here who joined us. I've been Amanda, you've been wonderful, and have a great evening. Thank you again for being trauma-informed with us.
Good night.
Good night. Let me just stop recording.